Okay, thanks. And I wanted to introduce my colleague, my associate, who's the author of the report. And of course, we utilized a lot of information from ISER, Toby's surveys and data, and also Matt's genetic valuations and such, and Jeff. So I felt it was kind of a nice group effort there. And so I'll just share some things that Earth Economics has done, maybe a half hour or so, and then we can just have more of a general discussion. And we'll be continuing some collaboration and work in the Matsu. We've received some more funding from the Moore Foundation over the next couple of years, and hopefully beyond that. We've been very excited to collaborate here in Alaska. It's kind of a time of a lot of transition, and Alaska's always had a lot of interesting ideas, just like the permanent fund and such. So we're kind of excited to move on. Hey. Okay, thanks. This is a nice audience member. So let's see. Okay, so I think the main, from ecological economics and economics perspective, I feel like we had a transition between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and it wasn't that we got rid of microeconomics when macroeconomics came around, but we got new measures, new ideas, new policies, etc. And I think the most important thing from the perspective that ecological economics adds, and maybe it's not that new for environmental economists, about the same, is that this is, when I went to graduate school and all, our vision was really the economy is kind of the big thing and the environment's the little thing. And if you look at the GDP, if you add up all agriculture, mining, oil industry, water production, natural resources in general, it adds up to about 2% to 3% of GDP. So, the environment is sort of the small thing when you measure it by GDP. On the other hand, when you think about our economy and that it sits within landscapes, all economies sit within watersheds. All economies sit within that landscape. And it's really important that landscape holds together. If it starts falling apart, then we lose these benefits. And measuring those benefits, I think, is critically important. And I just want to give one example. We've been working with FEMA over the last few years, and it has actually FEMA changed their policies nationally with dollar values that we provided for them, and it affects Alaska as well on kind of a grand scale with flooding, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is Hurricane Sandy, and Maya just in fact finished a report, which we're hoping to release soon, in Long Island Sound here, and the watershed in Long Island Sound. But this was Hurricane Sandy, and came in, did a huge amount of damage. That's ground zero in Manhattan, salt water pouring into the construction site. It was, of course, a huge hurricane. FEMA jumped into action. But I want to draw your attention to one aspect of sort of natural capital, natural systems versus built capital regarding water. So on the day after the hurricane, New Jersey Governor Christie declared a water emergency because the pumps went down, the filtration plants went down, and either you had no water at all on the New Jersey coast, or the pumps pulled in sewage water and there was no filtration, and so you had to boil your water. So it was a real crisis. And for people who were stuck out there, they didn't have access to clean water. And yet on the same day, the same morning, Mayor Bloomberg tweeted that New York City water totally safe to drink on Long Island, which had almost a parallel impact from the hurricane. And the reason is that instead of relying on, come on in.
Sorry.
Sure, no problem. Yeah. So instead of relying on pumps and filtration plants, New Jersey's water came out of the Catskills and is gravity fed, forest filtered, and totally storm resilient, a completely storm resilient system. So you had clean water throughout the whole Hurricane Sandy event on the New York side. And now New Jersey is spending about $2.6 billion to repair that capital intensive system. And again, it will be just about as brittle as it was before Hurricane Sandy. Now, there's a few interesting things. One thing is that if you look at the balance sheet of the New York utilities, they have more assets than New York as far as that provisioning system goes. The New York's watershed counts on the balance sheet just as bare land and timber value. There's actually no value for providing water. Whereas if you have filtration plants and pumping facilities, that counts on the balance sheet. So we've initiated, I'll talk about that just a little later, changing US accounting rules for actually all government agencies and public utilities. It's a very, very big deal. It would shift about $4 trillion. It would create, which actually already exists, $4 trillion of assets. So that, for instance, the city of Anchorage also, that system which actually provisions the water supply, forested system, would actually count. And we're also looking at following this study up with evaluation of aquifers. So again, when you think about natural capital, that it provides economic value, and we need to kind of value that and think about how we treat it as assets. So there's a group of utilities from San Francisco to New York, Seattle, Eugene, and others that have come together to say, yeah, we need this accounting change, because also if you show that your natural capital is in good shape, which actually provisions water, it changes the whole financing system for a utility. In other words, your bond rates can be lower because you're less risky than, say, West Texas for a loan. So even if all you're going to do is build pipes for the utility, you still are lower risk, and you can borrow more because you have larger assets, and you can pay a lower interest rate. So thinking about natural capital in that way, it really makes a difference actually for even funding built capital. So that's one thing we're working on, and so what we're trying to do there is improve kind of what I'd call the investment pro forma. That's your investment equation. And we had two utilities go to Moody's and Standard & Poor's to say, actually this should be noted. And San Francisco now puts a notation in their accounting about their natural capital and their estimated value of it. But anyway, it was very interesting, the discussion with the ratings agencies, because they sort of said, what? Trees, natural capital? One rating agency read none of the material at all. No wonder we had the financial crisis and kind of bad ratings for a lot of other things. And the other ratings agency said, wow, this is really interesting. Yeah, we think it's important, but we have to see a funding mechanism tied to it. And that was interesting. So we have about 14 utilities now that have adopted a natural capital charge on the books. One of them is Bellingham, Washington. So they have a $5 charge on the base rate and every other month, and a volumetric charge, and that's a natural capital charge. They use that to go acquire land, pay for easements and things like that up in the watershed. So these funding mechanisms, it's really interesting if you think about a water utility, and this is kind of the micro level implementation of some new ideas. We really haven't changed the way we do our billing in water utilities since the 20s hardly, except for now some water efficiency and some new ideas. So it's really a good time to think about new ideas with water utilities. Well, FEMA, after this process at Hurricane Sandy, we worked with FEMA for a year, and they approved a new policy, FEMA mitigation policy, et cetera. And it adopted dollar values just like we had in the Matsu Basin report for natural capital, riparian areas and open green space. And the implications of this policy are actually very large for FEMA. When there's a flood, you have a choice. Move the house out, or build it right back on the same concrete pad, or raise it. And typically FEMA would raise it or build it on the same concrete pad because it's expensive to pull the thing out. And most of the time, actually, people do want to move out when they've had 4 or 5 feet of water. But FEMA takes about 6 months to a year to do the economic analysis, even though they have a very quick toolkit. And so after you've been around for 4 months waiting, you've swept out the gravel and whatever that was in your house, then a lot of people also kind of want to stay. And so they approved this policy, and so 25% of a benefit cost analysis for mitigation can be assigned ecosystem service values. And that means that moving the house out now has much more benefit side, because you're measuring the value of that increased floodplain for example, flood hazard risk reduction. So if you move the house out, actually you have more flood storage space. You may have more conveyance space, depends on where it is. So FEMA adopted that, and then they realized they ran a test case of 33,000 houses for past floods and realized they could have saved several $billion across the US over a few decades if they'd had this in place before. So they approved 2 further policies. This was 2013 June. Then August they approved another policy because they realized with this calculation, any structure with $275,000 or less, they should just give people a check and move them out. It's 300% rate of return on typically avoidance of repetitive flooding. And that means now when the person's flooded and they're ready to move, you can give them the check and they can move out. And the third policy they approved, which we had suggested and talked to them about also, was looking at including sea level rise for coastal hurricanes. That sea level rise is taking place, and you just can't pretend that future risk is lower than it will be, pretending that there is no sea level rise. So those were 3 policies that FEMA adopted, and it really is changing their pro forma. Then we, just a couple of other cases I'll go through. This is the Green River Valley. So Seattle is here, and we've been looking at, there's 16 cities there. We've been looking at salmon restoration, stormwater risk reduction, flood risk reduction, because if you think about sort of the 20th century, it was one problem, one solution. We have a flood, we need levees. If we have stormwater piling up because we built too much pavement, we need pipes, just put it in the pipes. We have salmon problems, well now we need salmon restoration projects. There's no sort of, and same was true, like phones just delivered a phone call. Now we have kind of a systems approach. I got a little calculator and more things that I'd ever know what to do with this thing could do. And so thinking about a watershed is actually an economic component, a holistic system that delivers a variety of services that we can actually save a huge amount of money. And this, we've spent $1 billion or more already on flood risk reduction, and most of that money spent has been destroyed. Most of those levees were already wiped out, and then we built them again, and then they got degraded again, we built them again. So we looked at this watershed and set up some funding mechanisms. So you can also use these values on a per project basis. So in this case, we worked to identify $75 million of overlap projects between salmon restoration and flood risk reduction. And mainly they were setting levee setbacks. So then that helped for the flood agency, the local flood authority and Army Corps, prioritize those $75 million projects ahead of some other projects so you could get the salmon benefits as well. And this was a $5 million project. We call it the North Winds Weir. We did that in the economics for it in 2013. So this used to be a solid area here. This is in the transition zone for salmon, a very important area. If you don't save that, then you might as well forget salmon restoration anywhere else, because the juvenile salmon need 2 weeks in the brackish water to adjust to salt water. And in this river, they were pretty much just kind of slammed into salt water. But it still is the largest Chinook fishery in Puget Sound, the healthiest Chinook fishery. So also, by talking about ecosystem services, it kind of reduces a lot of social conflict, which we didn't really expect, I'd say, when we started this work. But this was a controversial project that Chamber of Commerce said, what are we doing, paying $2,000 per salmon? This is ridiculous. We are against this salmon restoration project. And then we met with Boeing, which is just downstream, and I met with the vice president and said, what's your biggest worry? Is it really Airbus or a flood on the Green River? And he sat back thoughtfully and went, we have so many orders for planes, we don't care about Airbus. But if we couldn't build them, if there was a flood, that's a disaster. And so Boeing came out and supported this, and then the Chamber of Commerce said, wait, there's flood risk reduction? Yeah, we need like 20 more of these projects. And so there was this group sort of voted unanimously to Chamber of Commerce, supported it then after sort of opposing it and such, and the project was completed and became a park, so there are benefits. This was a low-served area for parks, and so it had other benefits as well. And so, you can think about Alaska too, culvert replacements like salmon-friendly culverts. They're not only good for salmon, but they actually save more roads. They reduce stuff. And FEMA also had a previous policy. This is up in the Matsu FEMA had a policy that you had to replace a culvert with an identical culvert. You could not put a better culvert in. And fortunately, that policy was also changed. So a couple of other things I just wanted to mention here that if you think about where we've come from in economics, prior to the 1930s, we really had microeconomics. And it's microeconomics. I kind of love microeconomics because it's the theory of the firm, demand, supply, households, businesses, etc., and how you operate. That was wonderful. And yet, when the 1930s hit, we'd become sort of a national integrated economy, and we had no measure of unemployment, no measure of how much production we had. GDP didn't exist until 1934. No measure of inflation, no measure of the money supply, etc. And so you think, how can you manage an economy if you don't have any of those measures? And that's what happened. We had the horrific depression, and microeconomics was incomplete and insufficient for solving a nation-scale set of problems. And so we did get macroeconomics, and one thing we got with that were new goals, like let's have less unemployment, let's produce more stuff. That was actually never an economic goal on a national scale, to just produce more stuff. GDP measures how much we produce. And so we got new goals, and then we got new measures for those goals, like let's measure how much stuff we produce, and let's measure unemployment. The first national survey was the 1930 census for unemployment. And then, of course, the other 40, 50 macroeconomic measures we have. So from our perspective, and that's why we call ourselves kind of Earth Economics, is that we're sort of in another scale transition. We need to measure the value that natural systems provide. We didn't measure anything with aquifers before because, they're not a built capital asset. And so we don't, whereas you're required, I've been a geologist, actually. I worked in a coal mine and in the oil industry for a good amount of time, then went into economics, so I feel comfortable in that world. But one thing that, as a geologist, that always struck me odd when I was at the coal mine was the CFO of the coal mine would go to prison if they did not put the dollar value of our estimated coal reserves on the books. A water utility CFO will go to prison if they estimate the value of the aquifer that they're tapping out of. And so water has zero value underground, period. That's it. In this nation, water is worth nothing, and actually globally pretty much. That's why we're abusing aquifers. We have the U.S. Geological Survey, of our 48 most important aquifers, all are in steep decline except for 2. It's scary in the United States. Well, we don't treat them like we treat fossil fuel reserves. And of course, that deals with ownership, a lot of things. The straw to tap into water is worth a lot, but we don't even look at that as a stock of value underground, or an aquifer as a structure that produces economic value. Anyway, thinking about our history, the U.S. had kind of a rough economic history, I'd say, and we've applied a lot of policies that are different. This was a family of 11, 2 kids are working, and they combined earned $8 a week in 1914. All but 5 children worked, and the parents. So it's kind of a tough world out there when you think about all the policies we implemented. And one thing I want you to think about is how, for instance, we looked at roads. In 1914, this was a nation of dirt tracks, basically. And then we set up funding mechanisms at the city, county, state, federal level to build roads. We spent trillions of dollars on roads, and we had a lot of roads in the United States. It's kind of amazing, that system of funding mechanisms, and the same is true for other assets. And you think about even fisheries, that stock of fish out in the Bering Sea is worth 0. Kind of amazing. It's worth 0. It's only when you haul it in. We don't treat fossil fuels, we don't treat minerals, we don't treat other things that way that are natural capital. So maybe we need to think about that a little bit more. So built capital, social capital. We've been pretty good at measuring, I'd say, built capital. This is kind of a view of, GDP. We measure how much built capital is produced. We do measure, expenditures on health. We have one advisor who's wonderful, Lee Hartwell. He's a Nobel Prize laureate because he worked on DNA and all that. But he says we don't look at health as an asset. We only look at sickness. And we only spend money on sickness, and healthiness is worth zero. And just as a doctor and a scientist, he finds that weird and something that we shouldn't probably pursue in the long run. We need to look at healthiness. So thinking about human capital, our health, education, knowledge, skills, social capital, how we get along with each other, our laws, really fairness, equity, things like that. You can look at societies that really fall apart where Iraq, where groups are not treated fairly equally and there's huge social resentment and the society falls apart and built capital falls apart, etc. And then natural capital. And I'll just be really quick about our report, which Maya can speak more to, but how we look at our work with FEMA and in the Matsu Basin and Long Island and California, various other places, what we're saying is Mother Nature, natural systems, we get a lot of criticisms kind of from a lot of sides. Environmentalists say, we don't like you putting a dollar value to anything with nature. That's terrible. And then we get the other side, which says, how can you place those dollar values, on nature? Some are too high, or you used contingency valuation, etc. And from my perspective, you think about a human life, a person's life is invaluable. And yet it's kind of nice to work and get paid. And so we're not talking about the intrinsic value of nature, but we are saying Mother Nature, let's pay attention to the water Mother Nature produces, and let's pay attention to that economic value, which is very clear. And so some ecosystem services, I think, are quite easy to value, and some are more difficult. I'll go very quickly through this because you're probably already there, is familiar. So when we look at valuation of nature's benefits, there are goods, things that like water supply, which are already traded and have a sort of a market dollar value, and food, etc. And so goods are things you can drop on your toe, these categories. And these are pretty easy to value, I'd say, right up to here, because they all have markets. So when you think about valuation in Matsu or fisheries production or other things, you can put a dollar value to those things pretty quickly. It's not a complete value because it's maybe worth much more to people who, harvest a fish, etc., than that dollar value, but at least it's better than zero. And then there are services, things you can't drop on your toe. And here we look at, for instance, hurricane buffering, flood risk reduction, etc. Wetlands, we've done a lot of work in Louisiana showing the buffering value of wetlands. And so services, quite a long list, sediment transportation, etc. Anchorage is going to have increased sedimentation, so the harbor, and that means increased dredging of the harbor, etc. A very, very big problem in the future. And will the port be viable in the long run if that sediment increases? So, the more forested watershed you have, then potentially the less sedimentation. So these services used to be kind of hard to value, but thanks to wonderful environmental economics, people have been working on that for 30 years, and I'd say we can now value virtually all of them on this list. We've got really good methods for valuing those services. Then there's sort of another category, supporting services, like pollination, and these are more difficult to value. Like if you look at nutrient cycle, what's the phosphorus cycle worth? The fact that you can move soil, well, who knows? That's pretty hard to value, although there have been some attempts. Pollination is easier to value. We can put some values on biodiversity and habitat. So there are some categories that, we really as economists need to put our nose to the grindstone and work hard on figuring out how to better value them, but there are some techniques. And then finally, kind of cultural value. And these categories, again, recreation, we could look at travel cost, aesthetic value, hedonic values, which again, say I have a view of Mount McKinley, then you can estimate the increased value of that property. But I may not have property by Mount McKinley, but I get a lot of value out of the aesthetic value of Mount McKinley, and it doesn't count in any valuation. So often, valuing ecosystem services, we're only valuing kind of a thin slice of the total value when you think about it. And spiritual, historic, I always used to say it's impossible to value spiritual value and such, and several tribal members came up to me and kind of objected, and I found that interesting. Like one group, the Yakima tribe, they had a burial site in the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Took $40 million to kind of do what needed to be done with that. And so the tribal member came up to me and said, well, at least you could say that our burial site was worth $40 million because the government spent $40 million on it. So even, it's very interesting to see what people come up with for ecosystem services and how you might look at it. The Matsu Basin, really important. And just very quickly, I'll bring up a concept of how you think about, as an economist, one thing I like, if you can figure out what the provisioning assets are for an ecosystem service, who the beneficiaries are, and who the damagers are, then you kind of have what you need for a funding mechanism. Just like if I buy a bottle of Coke, I'm the beneficiary, I paid the money for it. Coca-Cola is the provisioner, and they get the money, and then you've invested in the system that provisions that asset. So that's how markets work, and that's how a stormwater district works too. If you have on the damaging side, if you have a lot of pavement, you pay a higher stormwater tax, and then that goes into the stormwater agency to pay for it. So you can think of these maps within, say, the Matsu or another area, Alaska, on different scales. What are the provisioning assets for water supply? Who are the beneficiaries? Well, a traditional water utility, everybody who turns on the tap, they're the beneficiaries, and then they pay back into that provisioning asset. We've never looked at aquifers and said that's an asset. Who are the beneficiaries? Who's impairing that aquifer? Well, we have. I mean, EPA will go after someone who's contaminated the aquifer, but it's kind of a big struggle to figure out it's only after it's damaged that you go, it's an asset. Now when we have to do a natural resource damage assessment to figure out what was really damaged. If your house is damaged, you already have an appraisal. You already have an idea that something valuable was there and damaged. So you can think of these things. Each one of these might have a provisioning map in the Matsu, might have beneficiary map, and an impairment map. So for flood risk reduction, it's a different map than for water provisioning. So you may have some areas that are really important to reduce, like a set of wetlands or whatever, to reduce floods. And levees also would be in that provisioning of assets. And the beneficiaries are going to be down low where flooding occurs. The drinking water supply may come from a different area, a different portion of the water supply. So that kind of thinking about that mapping is really important. And that leads to funding mechanisms, and I'll just be real quick on a couple of things. We finished a report in July, which is like the Matsu, on Santa Clara County. So this is San Jose, this is Silicon Valley, and it was with the Open Space Authority. And it said our open space is worth a lot. We did the same kind of appraisal, got a kind of a large value there. And then we also, in that report, looked at groundwater recharge. What are the areas that actually, the open space is what recharges groundwater? So our argument was, if you don't save open space, you're going to lose groundwater recharge, which they've lost. This was most of the real true aquifer recharge area in San Jose, because everything ends in there, and it's paved. So they just lost a huge amount of the recharge area. So last 2 weeks ago, they had a $84 million bond for open space, and they needed a 66% vote to pass it, and they got 67%. And it was really nice. Andrea, McKenzie, the head of the Open Space District, called me up and said, your report was so important, because the Chamber of Commerce had never supported an environmental bond in Santa Clara County before, and they supported this bond, and they quoted our numbers saying, actually, open space is an economic asset, and it's providing X dollars. So the head of the Chamber of Commerce. So again, we've been kind of impressed that this can bring people together from very divergent political views, these kind of ideas. So again, thinking about that, you can kind of map out. We didn't even, that was a map of, groundwater recharge, which is not even on this list. And then we did a thing for Tacoma Parks. This is Tacoma. They have 72 parks. They're a very aggressive park agency. We did a report showing, again, the economic value of parks for health, for education, for stormwater, a variety of things, as well as recreation. And it was really to bring over a vote on a bond of folks that didn't care that much maybe about parks. But they put up a $198 million bond in a city of 200,000 people, which seems incredible. And that also passed by over 66%, so 2/3 vote. So again, the idea that these are economic assets, let's think of nature as economic assets, can be helpful for bringing people together. So first our process is kind of to do the valuation, and then to think about mapping and modeling, and then how do you set up a funding mechanism that really builds better assets, retains your natural capital so that you can have a more prosperous economy. So I think I'll kind of tie up there. I can go into I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, kind of introduce everybody. So maybe because we have about 1 hour till 11 o'clock. Yeah, I think I'll tie up there. Just to say we did do the Matsu Basin valuation. One reason why the kind of big numbers are important, well, I'll give one last example, and that is in Louisiana in 2010, we did a report on the Mississippi Delta and said the Mississippi Delta is really about $1 trillion asset if you take into account all the fisheries production, recreation, storm risk reduction. Hurricane Katrina did $200 billion of damage in 24 hours, and they used to have twice as many wetlands. They used to have a 60-mile buffer. Now it's only 30 miles. Even that degraded the hurricane from Category 5 to Category 3, and we did a lot of research. And since then, the state of Louisiana they had about $200 million vision for restoration, and then it went to $12 billion, and then 2014 they have a $50 billion kind of approach, and with the BP spill, they have about $10 billion set aside. And then they came to us and said, we know we can't use the same kind of economics we've used in the past for restoration. And I'll just present, and this is why I think it's an exciting time for economics, an exciting time for Alaska and ISER. And by the way, I love ISER's work, Matt's stuff on the a number of things there. But anyway, Louisiana asked us to do the economics for 4 big diversions. If you're going to restore a delta, you need that deltaic, that dendritic form. The problem is that they've channeled the Mississippi, all the sediment goes off the continental shelf and it doesn't renew the wetlands, so you have subsidence and loss of wetlands. They've lost about 1,900 square miles. I mean, it's frightening what has disappeared. So they want to put in 6 big diversions, and these diversions are very big. One would be, 4 of them would be about 50,000 CFS, and a fifth and sixth might be 250,000 CFS. So these are really big things, and they're going to put a lot of sediment in there. But think about this. If you're going to buffer against hurricanes, if you build a levee, the day you build it, it performs better than any other day. Little rodents burrow into it, starts falling apart. When you build a diversion, the first day of its operation is its worst day because it's just putting that first set of silt out there, but it can operate for a long period of time. And as the decades proceed, now you're getting more and more hurricane buffering because you've built out that skirt, you're building out the wetlands, and you get more and more hurricane buffering. So if you use the discount rate of 7% or 5%, etc., you're going to build levees because they show up in the short run per divine allowed valley. And even Louisiana has said that can't work for us. So, there's some things. We've had meetings with OMB, and I'll be up there to meet with the Domestic Policy Council and CEQ and OMB in early December, saying we've proposed that OMB change its discount rate. And that's a big deal because it would affect all federal projects, health, education. And we've suggested either a dual discount rate where things that provide value over a longer period of time, like investment in primary education or investment in green infrastructure, have that lower discount rate. And then built structures like bridges or things that do fall apart in some number of decades have the higher discount rate. So that's very challenging, and I'd love any advice on advancing that you might have, because we find OMB is kind of split. There's some people who are really in favor of it, some people are not. So with that, I'll kind of tie it up to say that, even with Alaska and the permanent fund and things like that, I think it's very interesting to think about new funding mechanisms and how you really build real wages and jobs in an economy, thinking about your natural capital and its full value. Thanks a lot. Maybe we can go around and introduce, I wanted to say Maya Kosian really put our Matsu report together, and she's up here pretty regularly. But Maya.
So like Dave said, I'm Maya, and I've worked with various people here, Jeff and Toby, and used numbers from MAT study and study on our benefit transfer analysis for the Matsu Basin. And for the next 2 years, we are working with various groups in the Matsu, including the borough, to look at funding mechanisms, basically, specifically for the Matsu. So thinking about ideas like a recreation bond in the Matsu, or so any ideas, any collaborative efforts, we'd like to work with you guys.
And we're happy not to take credit for things too. I feel like ISER actually is the kind of institution that is recognized a little bit more within the state of Alaska and such, and we anything that we can just contribute, just like the work in Santa Clara, it was nicer for people in Santa Clara to kind of say, here's some ideas, values, and such, and move forward. But any other comments, or maybe you can just...
I think on the funding mechanisms, it's like people will take action if there's a crisis, and you don't have that impairment, that degradation that you deal with in Low 48 up here. So people may not be as aware of, well, is there really a problem? Well, we need to pay for maintaining existing service if they're not impaired. So I think that's the big hurdle.
I think that's very interesting.
Unless the mind goes in and takes out all the recreational values and visual values and stuff like that, that's on the table, and that's you. It's a real threat. But other than that, the Mad River may go across its side once in a while and change course, but other than that.
Well, it's interesting too to think about some larger funding mechanisms. Like one thing we worked on in Ecuador that Maya also worked on there was stopping oil drilling and setting up a larger funding mechanism. We had two suggestions, but one of them, which I think was the more hopeful, was actually we went to OPEC, and President Correa went to OPEC and said if they charged 4 cents a barrel on oil, you could raise a fund of about $4 billion per year, and you could put that back into countries that said actually the biodiversity value is too great or whatever, and they would have 4 funds. And OPEC was actually interested in the idea because it's not too burdensome, and it would be very interesting. So you can think about some mechanisms that might bring funding back to Alaska, which are outside of Alaska. Oh yeah, and I'll just give one.
I think that's our biggest asset.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that certainly potential for bringing in money from other areas to pay for ecosystem services that are kept.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just give one other kind of creative idea. In Louisiana, we've said, look, for the state, you have this kind of bulge of money coming from BP, but that's going to go away, and it's not going to achieve your goal of full restoration. So one thing we suggested, right now there's a dredging charge at all ports in the United States. So all cargo gets charged a certain amount, and Seattle and Tacoma, we have deep water ports, so the money goes to Anchorage or mainly Louisiana to dredge the Mississippi. But we said in Louisiana, if you charged $1 per container, or it could be based on value, you'd raise about $450 million a year. And it could be because the Mississippi is providing conveyance and navigation value, then you could do that. And the reason, of course, Louisiana loves that idea is that, and it could be added to the current charge, but anyway, the reason they love it is exporters from China will pay a tiny bit, Midwest farmers sending their grain down pay a tiny bit, but it's not very burdensome because it's so thinly spread. They're not going to divert any cargo with a small charge like that, but it concentrates the value there. So, And they love that idea because it's not trying to force people just in the coastal zone to pay $50 billion, and that system provides service. So anyway, other suggestions or questions? Because I think Alaska, of course, it's always been natural assets. Matt?
I'd like to needle you guys.
Good.
Yeah.
We love it. We're used to it.
Of course, the comment that I made that they David and certainly pay attention to is that many ecosystem services are inherently local.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just take a value that is generated from a study in one place and say it works somewhere else. It'd be like saying, well, here's the value of ecosystem of groundwater recharge in Santa Clara County, California. It works for the map value of Alaska. Well, of course not, because we don't have the same water shortage, at least not yet. But if we did, we would see. And so things like the sort of the scarcity of the resource, if it's a global scarcity, well then yes, it does make sense to do the transfer of benefits. Because carbon sequestration in Alaska is worth as much as it is in Saudi Arabia or in the Amazon. So, but if it's essentially a locally consumed thing like recreation or cultural values, we're not piping water all over the world. Yeah.
I think that's one of the great challenges of this work, really, is that, like you say, global, if you sequester carbon, it kind of doesn't matter where you sequester it, you've added that value. So it is a global value. But so many values are local, just like groundwater. It's completely different here from California. So you can't transfer a value from California here. And part of what Matt's alluding to is when you do sort of this appraisal, the way we do that analysis is we look at these ecosystem services and then all the land cover types, and does the value exist here? You can put an X, and then you can look at, is there a dollar value for that we can establish, and it's a real challenge to say, this would require, I don't know how many values was it for the Matsu, maybe 140 or so.
If you go back a couple slides.
Oh.
No, that words. Yeah. So we did use 3 values for
Far away
risk reduction for boreal forest in Scandinavian countries, but most of the studies came from the U.S., northern U.S., Minnesota, Canada, and of course the local Alaska studies.
Local values.
They're useful as illustrations of how much these services could be worth, but they don't really, I don't think they inform the Matsu thing that much, other than to say, well, this is sort of how it works in the economy of a valuable service.
Yeah.
So that to me that's a challenge that's largely a technical challenge.
Yeah.
The thing that I guess, since I agree with the overall premise completely of the need to value ecosystem services, and the fact that it's so many aspects of economic valuation, the gross domestic product metric, which was actually a product of the Depression and World War II. It was invented, because remember, it was invented many years ago for a specific purpose. That trying to use that and then expand it incrementally to incorporate more aspects of life is limited by the nature of that valuation tool to begin with. So really what you're trying to do is use valuation methods that come from sort of market value of produced goods and services, and then applying it to the rest of the things that people value. And it gets, as you get farther and farther away from the original purpose, it gets more and more, I guess, not the values mean less and less. So that's the basic problem. I mean, for example, just look at gross domestic product. One of the key issues that has come up relatively recently, and it's relatively recently, not in real time, but in sort of over the time that we've been thinking of gross domestic product. So it's like maybe the past 20 years, or 30 years out of the 100 that people have been thinking about that, has been the fact that gross domestic product doesn't really, it doesn't value household production. And so
Yeah.
the contribution to sort of life support made by women is systematically undervalued to the extent that women are doing more in the household and it's not going through the market. So economists have known this forever, right? Economists have always known this, but they never wanted to talk about it. So feminist economists come along and sort of rub people's noses in it and say, well, you really counted it equally, and then you have to value the services of reproduction and all, and then but then if you start to do that, what it points out is that gross product valuation doesn't really tell you very much about value. And so the same applies, all that argument applies to system services valuation. And I guess I'd like to see more explicit taking on this bigger challenge. And here's sort of another example in healthcare. Economists have realized, well, you're valuing expenditures on healthcare. So really what you're doing is you're putting value on sickness, right? Or you're avoiding sickness or recovering from sickness. So you're not putting value on health. So how do you value health? Well, the metrics have come up, they're talking about is like quality adjusted life years. So it's some measure of time, right? It's a measure of how much more time controlling for the quality of life. So it's not longer life at a lower level of function, etc. The quality so it's a measure of time. And I'm thinking that kind of creativity really needs to be developed for ecosystem services. I know in my work once I published one study where we valued subsistence harvesting. So well, you can't put a dollar value on it because it's subsistence. So I put it in time. And when I tried to get this published, the economics reviewer said this was bullshit because it was it was time. And I said, well, it was climate change cost these people a day a year. Now it doesn't seem very much, but a day a year. So okay, now there are only 364 days a year instead of 365.
And I think those are really big issues. Like working in Ecuador with indigenous people, one of the chiefs came to us and said, if this oil is not tapped, no one in the world's quality of life will really change much. But if it is, ours will be destroyed. Because our whole area will be destroyed.
Working with indigenous people, it sort of brings this issue up to the forefront.
It does.
It should be there anyway.
It should
because when you deal with cost-benefit analysis framework, you're accepting all of the problems inherent with it. For example, distribution doesn't matter. You add up the cost and benefits without regard to who's receiving them.
Right.
And more is better than less, infinitely. And so you get these astronomical values you can, and they're meaningless because, of course, nobody earns that much money. So, anyway, I'd just like to see this taken more.
I agree. I think that is the way it should go. Really, I think it is a much more fundamental kind of critique in a lot of ways. It's like if we start saying, for natural systems, we have to look at health. For people, we have to look at health. We have to look at what the goal of a high quality is. And in the 1930s, most people in the U.S. didn't have indoor plumbing, so we need to produce more plumbing, and that's kind of what the GDP focused on.
Well, it was if we're mobilizing for war, how much can we produce relative to Germany? And we're afraid that Germany is they realize they do the GDP and say, oh, actually our economy is 3 times as big as Germany's. And that was classified secret information because they didn't want to, if the U.S. wanted to keep, Roosevelt wanted to keep that private.
And it was amazing because the US, because of the GDP in its calculation, we actually did know where all the copper was being produced and how much machinery we had. And so he better predicted how much the US really could produce. Even Ford couldn't believe they could produce so many vehicles. But another interesting thing about GDP is, of course, it was the gross national product, which we got scrapped in 1991 and switched to the GDP. And the reason was the gross national product was about US companies. What's the total product of all US companies? So if you had an oil operation in Saudi Arabia, that counted in our GDP because it was owned by a US company. And then they realized by 1991, because of all these joint ventures and everything else, it was impossible to calculate the GNP, and we just needed to draw a line because you had to subtract out Toyota's plant in the US because that's part of Japan's GDP, not the US GDP. And so then they just decided, we don't care if Toyota produces it or who, we're going to draw the line around the US. But even that has become super complicated. I mean, they're really struggling because, say, Boeing manufactures an airplane, parts have been manufactured, scattered across the planet, and then they just kind of assemble it. How much do you really count as GDP in the US? It used to be that all those little titanium screws were made in the US. Now they're made in Japan or China or wherever.
It's interesting. I think the reason that they changed is because they realized that a third of the gross national product of Mexico is being produced in the United States.
I think you're right too. That's right.
Maybe an eighth of the population of Mexico living in the United States, or producing a third. But you know, I saw that as different. I thought when it was published publicly, it was the gross national product for the purpose that you said. But the original accounting was gross domestic product. Simon Kuznets, I actually was fortunate to hear Simon Kuznets, the guy who invented GDP,
wow,
and got the Nobel Prize for it. I heard him when he was about 75 years old give a lecture on the history of it, and when I was a student, and it was absolutely fascinating. And we go through and talk about the 1920s and 30s and the National Board of Economic Research in the late 30s. And
that is amazing.
And it's classic, you know, being brought into the war board in World War II. And so the gross domestic product was actually a classified number.
Isn't that amazing?
But then, of course, after World War II, the U.S. the victors wanted to trumpet their success.
Well, it's amazing how, you know, it's been macroeconomics has been so thoroughly adopted then worldwide, whether even China, et cetera, not North Korea, but you know, a state like Alaska, its natural capital is so gigantic, and yet that's not so well measured. So, but all those challenges, you know, you bring up, those are exactly. I mean, it must have been sort of things that Simon Kuznets struggled with initially when they're trying to figure out what to include, what to exclude in GDP and
and the bias was clearly towards something that was relevant for national defense. To include that because they include the factories because you could change them into producing tanks, producing cars. So you don't worry about the ecosystem services that well, anyway.
But what do you think about ISER and its, you know, the work that you've got going and some of these ideas too? Because I think with health and, you know, just like even access to healthcare, it's so different, wildly different in Alaska compared to, say, the East Coast where you just drive a short distance, you're at the hospital, you don't have to take a plane and everything else. It's just such a different economy, really.
It's unfortunate that the guy here who does health economics and regional macroeconomic kind of stuff is teaching right now. But and the other guy is Matt Reimer, just was here and then left. He also is teaching today.
Oh yeah.
He does fisheries and economic services. Naturally, I feel like they're not capitalism, but
I've always felt, yeah. Like fisheries, it's amazing. You think about Bering Sea and more fish are dumped as bycatch than are kept on the East Coast, the whole East Coast. Just such a hugely productive system. And yet those fish only have value kind of when they're hauled out. And I have always felt like we should think of the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, you know, think of those stocks, which are always fluctuating. Really is in situ value, just like we do oil in the North Slope.
What do you think would be the benefits of valuing the fish in the sea? You think that would lead to better protections of the habitats? Things like that?
I do. If you think about the pollock fishery, for example, and you have some coastal catcher boats and they haul in factory trawlers. And there's a very interesting difference between those two. And it's with what the difference between bycatch is when you catch other species, and discards are when you catch the target species but throw those out. And what's interesting is the factory trawlers have a much larger amount of discards. So in other words, pollock, for instance, in the huge schools of pollock are rated on size. And if you take your giant toe and you catch pollock that are a little small for the filleting machines, it's easier to go throw those out and go take another toe and get those that are a little bit bigger. And so the discards are it's very interesting, that dialogue, whereas catcher boats, which can't discard and actually utilize on the right out to sea, when they do that big tow, they're more careful. Actually, they have less discards because they have to haul them all the way back into. It's not as easy for them to discard their catch and take another tow. And so you have a slight difference in how clean the fishery is, depending on whether your processing is at sea or on the shore. It's really interesting. And I think if you said, hey, those discards, you have to pay something for that. That was an asset that you just wasted, because that's next year's full-grown pollock. You know, it shouldn't be tossed off at zero cost, really, or 4-hour tow.
But it's going to go somewhere. It's going to go on the sea floor where it likely benefits scrap.
It doesn't
Well,
only
that's true.
deplete
Does
the
it?
cost of what you can sell a live salmon for if we catch salmon bycatch. It's also the native on the upriver who doesn't get any.
Exactly.
And his family has to choose either between food or heat, and
That's
because
right.
there's no salmon in the river, he's got to go buy something at his door,
Mm-hmm.
which is exponentially more expensive to buy upriver than it is here in Anchorage. So
That's exactly right.
he has to pick up his whole family and move to the city, where a lot of them end up homeless because they don't realize that it costs a lot more to live here than it is to live there.
Yeah,
So
that
kind
impact
of
is
cost.
huge.
I've got the actual numbers of the salmon bycatches.
And what amazes me with the salmon bycatch, if you're actually a fisherman and you catch too many Chinook salmon, then you get a big fine, you get your gear taken away. But if you have 65,000, like one tow, this was a few years ago, one of the factory trawlers got 65,000 Chinook salmon and dumped them all over, and there's no fine. That
Yeah,
just
that's
seems,
crazy.
seems
They're
totally
saying
crazy.
that they caught 15,020 Chinook salmon this year, and they're saying that they caught 10,400 last year. We all know those numbers are false.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Well, it's,
But that's the official
that
report.
regulation is changing, and that's one specific thing in that Valley is working on. That's
Wow.
economics of different ways of charging for bycatch.
Great.
And the question is, if you do have, like the whole fishery, there's collective punishment. And if the bycatch number gets to a certain level, the whole fishery gets shut down. So the question is there, to what extent is there like self-policing within the industry? Because everybody knows who it is who's catching the bycatch. And he's showing that, yeah, absolutely there is. So even though it's, well, I mean, this gets into the other issue of the property rights to all these natural assets. And some of them are owned privately, some of them are sort of considered to be government owned and managed by governments, and a lot of them are just common, like the commons. And the governance of the commons, you know, how well, there's a lot of literature that's showing that shows that sort of the more that the commons is locally important, that it's generally gets managed fairly well.
That's right.
It becomes sort of a global asset, the less likely it is to be, more likely you're going to have a tragedy in the commons kind of situation. So that's another.
Yeah.
So which are the marine resources you're privately owned?
Well, like
I suppose ITQs
in
might
marine
be.
mammals?
individual transferable quotas, you have
Oh.
example of where there's a lot of private ownership, and then you have, say, in marine mammals where only Alaska Natives are allowed to harvest them, you have local statistics, or co-management boards that do a lot of self-policing. And so you don't really need to have private ownership.
And one thing, just like if you think about economics, should kind of be also about rising real wages, rising quality of life, greater employment and such. And you think about if that fish is a table fish that comes back to the community, that value really, you get a huge amount of value out of it. And as you say, if equity value for someone who doesn't have to go spend money on food and can spend it on heat or education or other things, it makes a huge difference. If you look at the pollock fishery too, if you're producing surimi, you're getting hardly any money out of a fish. And it's only, I think, 16 or 18% of the fish that's actually used. Whereas even if that same pollock came to be a table fish, you can eat 80% of it. So and it's a higher value. But so you think about the value that's retained within coastal areas or for local people. I just feel as though we could make a lot of progress on we worked on the spot prawn fishery from Alaska down to California. And that's a very interesting fishery because Alaska banned trawl caught spot prawn, and it's only trap caught. And then British Columbia, and then Washington, Oregon, and California. And so you could actually reduce catch and have greater conservation, but the price is like $10 to $18 a pound versus $2 to $3 a pound trawled for that trap caught. And so incomes went up, fishing time went down, and then there were policies that said you could only have, I think Alaska, it's 500 pots per ship or per owner, and that's it. So then that policy made it much more coastal and locally owned sort of fishery and such. So I just think there are a lot of, there you could increase real wages and increase the product value and decrease bycatch enormously and damage to the seabed and such. So I just think there's a lot of progress to be made there.
Who manages the spot?
Spot prawn is all state managed because it's really within 3 mile limit. So each state, and California was the last one. And just another note on spot prawn, which is so strange. Spot prawns are all male until year 3, and then they all turn female. It's a very weird species. And so Alaska and BC have totally opposite policies, and I couldn't tell which one is better. In Alaska, it's against the law to fish during the gravid period, when they have the eggs. And that's because Alaska says, well, you don't want to take them at that time. And British Columbia has said, it doesn't matter when you take the females anyway, you're reducing the population. So their policy is to fish during the gravid period because the shrimp are worth more and they weigh more and you take less altogether. Isn't that curious? So you have absolute opposite policies, but there's no indication yet which one is better, I guess. And the other thing that BC did was they made very tiny spot prawn districts. And what I like is I think it's the first time you've had a stock independent fisheries model. So, and the reason it's stock independent is that the way they regulate it is when in one district, everybody has to report their catch. And if you see the ratio of females falling to males, that means you're catching the big shrimp out, then they close that district and all the districts around it. Isn't that interesting? And then that way, they prevent overfishing without really knowing fully what the stock is. Because they say they're too short-lived, they can't tell what the stock is anyway, and everybody's kind of guessing. So I kind of like this experimentation in policy. Who knows what's really better, but we should find out, hopefully.
I wanted to ask you a quick question.
Sure.
Since you're here and you're the expert. So I think you did a good job talking about, cultural and spiritual values. We only captured maybe a thin slice of that. But when the goal of these kind of studies is to forward this on to decision making, to maybe get funding to support ecosystem services, and you're only capturing a thin slice of cultural and spiritual services, it seems like the danger there is that they'll be overlooked. Do you have any idea on how to better afford those kind of services?
This is an issue that we've actually grappled with a lot, because we totally agree with that viewpoint. That cultural values are undervalued. So right now we're doing a study with the Forest Service, Zach on our staff, on better looking at cultural value. And so we've worked with Kathy Wolf, who's really wonderful at University of Washington, and a number of other people. I think it's a huge challenge. And I think in some ways, by valuing ecosystem services, you're breaking a little bit out of the traditional view, and then you can get to the others. And working with Native Americans has been really interesting also. For instance, this work on Hanford with 3 tribes, the Umatilla, the Yakima, and the Nez Perce. And that was so interesting, because at first, the Yakima said we have to do valuation of cultural value. And the reason is that under NERDA, cultural value is recognized. And the more value that's there and damaged, the more they have to clean up. And so the Umatilla and Nez Perce at first said, we absolutely do not want valuation of cultural value, because that's just against our viewpoint. And then they all got together and they went, actually, we like that idea now, because if it results in more cleaning up of the system, then we are going to work at it. So, I just found the whole discussion. But the other piece that those 3 tribes brought to the discussion, which I thought was incredible, was one of the Nez Perce tribal elders. You have discounting, and the Department of Energy uses discounting. And really with Hanford, if you use almost any discounting, then put some plastic over it all and wait for 500 years and let everybody there deal with it. And so this elder came and said, we are not going to value any future generation less than the present generation. That's totally wrong. And so as Earth Economics, we will bring this forward. And so we went to the trustees and we had a big meeting there, and the three tribes were there too. And we said, as trustees, it's not your job to maximize present value. As trustees, your job is to look across all generations. The view of the Nez Perce, is actually the right view. And fortunately, the Department of Energy went crazy. They hated that viewpoint. But Washington and Oregon said, actually, we agree with it. We are trustees. And so they kind of got a majority vote. But that's all churning around because OMB doesn't allow it.
You hear what you wish for.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges, okay, if you're not going to use discounting, then how are you going to project what the values are going to be in 500 years or 50,000 years? I mean, of course you can't. And so the valuation method becomes meaningless.
And I think that is exactly right, Matt. And so in that case, what you have to say is actually people in 500 years deserve clean water. And so it's a physical.
Well, are people even going to live that long? Are there still going to be people here?
Well, hopefully the assumption is that there will be.
Well, I don't know. I mean.
But it's interesting because otherwise you look at
people here for 500,000 years, but certainly not North America.
Well, it's an amazing challenge. You're right. It's an amazing challenge because, in 500 years, plutonium is making its way to the Columbia, and right now is the cheapest time to clean it up, we think, because it hasn't gone so far. So now, but it's a big investment to clean it up.
Right. And I just think that's an example of where valuation in dollar values does not really make any sense. It's like, is this it's an ethical argument. You either think, well, we don't care, or we do.
Mm-hmm. So then the Department of Energy says, well, we've already spent $135 billion at Hanford. How much more do we spend? And because I agree with you, I think it is an ethical decision, and it's people in the future deserve what is it,
Same goes with
plutonium.
climate change. It's like you
Yeah.
can't answer the climate change debate by putting a dollar value on the cost of climate change.
Yeah. And yet it requires,
Yet economists are spending a huge amount of effort trying to do that.
yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wait.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. And
Yeah, thank you.
what are your names again?